All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here at Fathering Together for our next live conversation around race and fatherhood, and in this specific case, cross-racial friendships. We've got some great panelists with us today, and so I want to do a quick round of introductions of them to you all, and then I'm going to actually step away and allow them to lead the conversation with one another. I'm really excited for this time, and if you are listening, watching in real time with us, feel free to share any questions or comments in the chat. I will feed those to our participants as they are talking to help weave those questions into the conversation at large. But really quickly, I'm going to share these into our groups on Facebook. So if you'll give me 1 second, we'll get this going. And as I'm doing this, I will do some introductions of our panelists as well. So first we have Britt Holmberg, and he is here in Chicago with me. He is an educator around social justice work and white allyship, as well as a dad of 2 very excited children that we might be hearing in and out throughout this call. And they're awesome. They're great. And then we have Corden James, who's a motivational speaker and community leader out in the Boston area, but is joining us from Utah at the moment while he's on a trip with his kids. So we appreciate you taking a step away from the family, Corden. And next we have Didon Bruner from the DC area. He does a lot of mediation work. He's a blogger. He runs a community space called On Fathering. I highly recommend checking out that storytelling space and resources that they have to offer. And last but not least, we have Luke Chitwood here in Chicago as well, who does a lot of grant writing and storytelling and consultancy work with nonprofits to help them grow in their vision and mission. So again, I thank you all for being here. Thank you all for joining us out in the Facebook world. I will now turn it over to let each one of them share a little bit more of why they joined the panel and the work that brought them here, and step back myself and allow the conversation to go. And I'll jump back in at the end to wrap us up. So that being said, I'll turn it over to, we'll go in reverse order for the introductions so that, Luke, you're not last every time. So Luke, why don't you go with introducing yourself and connecting to this work.
Cool. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, really excited to join the conversation today. I am glad to be a part of this, and coming to this from a background in education, specifically as a high school teacher in college access in New York City and Chicago, and now as a writer and consultant. Also a father to an almost 3-year-old girl and another who is coming in just a few weeks. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I think the different places that I've lived and the people that I've met are a big part of who I am today and like why I wanted to be part of this conversation. I grew up in a extremely homogenous community and have been fortunate in the years since to get to meet all sorts of different people in Oklahoma and New York City and Chicago and elsewhere too. So I'm excited that our conversation today has lots of places and perspectives and backgrounds. Thanks.
Hey guys, my name is Didon Bruner. As Brian said, I'm in Washington, D.C. You know, when I grew up, I swam and I played water polo. So I've been in places where I was the extreme minority. Then I moved to DC, went to Howard twice, and now I still live in the city. So I've been in places where on my average day, I may not see anybody who doesn't look like me. The other day, I was in a Zoom conversation with one of the guys from Fathering Together, and my daughter commented later, Daddy, I didn't know that you knew any white people. And it occurred to me that, our children's impressions of how they see race has a lot to do with what they see us do. So one of the things that I do is I'm a podcaster. I have a podcast called Dad Genes, exploring the DNA of healthy fathering. And I think it's important to have conversations that deal with the whole spectrum of fatherhood, and race is definitely one of them. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Dayton. My name is Corden James. I am here in St. George, Utah at this time. I currently live in Boston, Massachusetts. I am currently visiting my two sons who live out here. They're 11 and 12. My daughter is 6, and she joined the trip with us as well. So I'm sitting in my lovely car now. Some of my focus has been based around community involvement. So I do lead a group of volunteers locally to attach them to local volunteering opportunities. Also do that with my daughter. And then we run a couple different businesses, little side businesses with her. And so when it comes to fathering, a father of 3, and have been very busy with the process of learning how to co-parent with them. I did grow up in a transracial adoption from the age of 3. So I grew up in Utah as one of the few Black men in Utah, growing up in a white family, growing up in a white community. And it has been an interesting aspect, and I hope to be able to bring that here to you today and cross lines with my friends here.
Great. Yeah, my name is Britt Holmberg. I live in Chicago. I have 2 kids, a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, who give me a run for their money every day, all day, especially during this pandemic. I am a therapist. I'm a social worker by training and currently doing therapy at a college wellness center. And I also do a training called, with a colleague of mine, called Becoming an Anti-Racist Social Worker. So I've been working on trying to help therapists and clinicians integrate principles of anti-racism into like clinical work and therapeutic work. And also my partner, Megan, my wife, is a facilitator, or she started an organization called Speak Up, which works to help teachers and parents talk about race and racism with their children. And so I'm a facilitator with that. And one of the things we talk a lot about is kind of like what Dean was saying, is just, and like our kids are like sponges, and they soak up everything that we say or what we don't say, and kind of how we react to situations and who we're friends with. And so it's really important to me to be modeling anti-racist parenting, essentially, and in terms of raising up a generation of kids who aren't going to be, that don't think that racism is normal or healthy, and that are challenging that and speaking out against it. And I think, part of the reason why I wanted to be on this panel was just because there's so much going on around race and racism in our country right now. And I really wanted to help people think about what it's like to have conversations that don't end with people, especially across racial lines, that don't end with people getting super angry and cutting off, but that really allow for deeper understanding and allow for empathy and deeper connection. Because I think that's the way through this. One of the ways through this is really hearing one another and supporting one another and feeling the pain of racism, and working then to end it, and to think about how to put a stop to it. So that's really one of the main reasons why I wanted to show up and talk about this today.
All right, well, we have these questions. Why don't we jump in?
Excellent. Do we know the questions, Brian?
So the first one was, how does having diverse relationships impact or inform your abilities as a father?
Okay. Say that one more time there, buddy.
Sure. How does having diverse relationships impact/inform your abilities as a father? If you think they do.
Interesting subject, brother. I guess I'll start.
Sure.
So I think it impacts it hugely in every aspect. Whoever I bring around, my friends, whoever I choose, because it starts with me at the end of the day. The relationships that I choose to have and bring around my children are going to be crucial. And it was never a subject or an idea of needing to mix in more diversity into our families and friendships. And I think, just being here now with my kids, where I do live in Utah and they do not see many black men, um, and fathers and such like that, I think has been eye-opening and challenging to me as well, to understand how they see the world, where racism isn't as prevalent, where it is much more silent, and um, privilege is different for them. They grow up in a mixed family. So, we're going to explore some of those things too.
So for me, I think most of what we try to do as fathers is to give our kids context. We travel so that they can see what it's like to be in a different place instead of read or just hear about it. We take them to experiences so that it can add texture to their experience. And I think that the relationships that we have also, on two different scopes. In terms of our children seeing us interact and agree, disagree, laugh, cry, and do different things with a diverse group of people. It gives them permission to, but it also informs our context as well. When there's something that, if I had a question about Utah, I now know who I can call.
Absolutely.
And having a greater pool of people, resources to interact with is valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, thanks, Dean. And I think the context and texture that you described is a big part of what I want for both of my daughters, and what I hope to kind of the environment I hope to build for them as they're growing up. And I'm also reminded of your comment about empathy in the intro, Britt. Just that so much of that I think is something that you can't necessarily instruct directly. You can't tell someone how to be empathetic as much as you can show them different experiences and different perspectives. And I'm mindful of raising children in a diverse yet really segregated city like Chicago. And I think as a white man, I would be able to either opt out of diversity and surround my family just with people that look like me, or to, but I want us to make the choice to opt in, where my daughter sees everyone as a neighbor and a friend, and doesn't respond in fear, but responds as a friend and with empathy to anyone she meets.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of what you all have said. I'm thinking about, I had a friend over for a social distance beer last night, who's Asian American, and we chatted, we just caught up because we hadn't seen each other in a while, and I was asking him, how has it been for you because I know there's been a lot of racism against Asian Americans with COVID, and have you been affected by that? And he has, and he told me a story about how it impacted him and his family. Just, he lives literally a block away, and it was really, sad for me to hear that, and sad to know that another one of our neighbors who's white uh, contributed to his pain, and especially his kids' pain, because they were really confused. And I just feel like that kind of those kind of relationships, being able to have a real kind of connection with someone and talk to them, that makes me a more kind of complete person, in the sense that I have a better, clear understanding of what my neighbors are and what my friends are, kind of what their reality is, and then I can, like you all have said, I can provide that context to my children and say that's not right, we don't believe that. And when someone says something that is racist or that's harmful, that's a lie, and that we don't, that's not what we believe as a family, and let's talk about that, let's kind of unpack that together. So having those relationships allows us to, it's not why we have those relationships, but it's like a byproduct of those relationships, helps us to be more engaged with our neighbors, more engaged with our friends, and to provide
Mm,
support and to speak up like if things like that unfortunately do happen, as they do, we
abs
know they do.
absolutely. Hey, now, Brother Bray, I'm curious, are your kids around the same age?
My oldest is 6, and I have a 3.5-year-old.
Okay. And then your friend, is his kids around the same age as well?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So he has two of our kids are about the same age, and then he has an older daughter who's I think in like 3rd grade.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I think that's interesting, seeing how that impacts a family. What are their conversations based around that actual impact of that event, and what are they doing going forward? I feel like that's very valuable for you to be able to hear, to see how, to be able to take that back and hear from, how would you address it with your family? And even better if you can get both of your families together and be able to talk about that in an open discussion. I think that's
Hmm.
even more valuable because you get that real time feeling of the rawness of experience that. Because unfortunately, sometimes we don't always recognize racism, nor can we call it out if we don't recognize it. And I think as an ally, I think that's one of the most important things is being able to. I'm going to recognize it, but being able to see, and same, racism goes both ways too. But being able to see the not just the unjust side of it, but the slight misappropriation of the words or the situation.
Mm. Yeah.
You know, but you used the word byproduct, and I think that was the perfect phrase because it triggered a thought that we all have blind spots,
Mm. Hmm.
and one of the byproducts in having spouses and people around us who are not just like us is they help us to see our blind spots. And
Hmm.
it doesn't even have to be specific, overt, but just in interacting with them, we learn a little bit more about ourselves, and the more blind spots that we can be aware of. Not that we'll be perfect, but we just kind of we're able to develop a better sense of checks and balances as we go along. So I just wanted to appreciate your use of the word byproduct because it made me think.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Thanks. I definitely feel that. Like, and that's, yeah, I think that's a lot of what sort of flows out of these relationships is just like me being aware of my blind spots and then working on that stuff so that they're not there or they're not causing pain or hurting others.
Mm. Absolutely.
So question number 2 was, how do we talk about race when we aren't talking about race? And I love this question, so I'm just going to jump in.
Go for it.
With my daughter, our conversations are value based, and because I think that values are consistent across the board. In terms of if we're talking about inequity, be it how girls are treated instead of boys, how bigger kids are treated instead of little kids, dealing with bullies, dealing with teachers, dealing with authority figures, those values tend to tend to be where we always boil back down to. So when it's an issue about race, we can also have those values. How do we treat people? What are the things that we expect? What are our expectations of you? And you'll hear a lot of things like unfair, and that's not right. But even that is based on what our kids feel, what their values are. And so if you don't have those conversations, then it would be very difficult, I imagine, to have a conversation about race because it's not anchored in anything.
Mm. Hmm.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about like providing that context for
Yeah.
for your kids.
Dayton, can you restate the question again, brother?
Sure. How do we talk about race when we aren't talking about race? And I'll give you an example. When we talked about unfortunately, my daughter saw the video of George Floyd being killed, and
Okay.
she said, but that cop isn't white. And so we boiled it back down to values. What is your responsibility when you see someone doing something that they shouldn't be doing? What is your responsibility when you're with your friends and your friends suggest something that you know is not right? So, yes, there are definitely issues of race here. There are definitely issues of, there are a million different issues presented by that video. But when I think about what I want to talk to a 9-year-old about, or what kind of tools I want her to have in her toolbox, is one, how to stand up when you see something that is wrong. Two, when you are doing something that may not be wrong, are you able to be corrected? One of the things I tell my daughter and her friends are, I like that you guys hold each other accountable to your best. Because it can be the exact opposite way. And so that's one of the ways we had that conversation. That's where we started. I mean, that conversation's had a lot of iterations, as you could imagine. But I think starting in terms of what is it that we know is right, and working from there has been helpful.
Mm-hmm. I think like for me and my partner, it's also about what sort of books are we reading to our kids? Um, what sort of media are we exposing our kids to? Because, so much of racism, I think, and what kids learn about race gets passed through the media. And so like, we can say one thing and then they can watch a show or they can read a book and be like, wait, but that's not what you said, and they can get these mixed
Mm-hmm.
messages. So I think the statistic is like white kids need to be exposed to, especially if they live in like a predominantly white community, the books they need to read need to be about 60 to 70% characters of color, for them to balance out the sort of messages they are getting about um, white supremacy and racism. And so like we're very intentional about the books we read our kids. We try to lift up um, both activists and people who are doing like heroic things, but then also people who are like kids who are doing everyday things, right? And families of color who are doing everyday things. As a way to try to challenge some of these negative stereotypes that they are likely picking up from the media or from whatever else, they're getting school, that kind of stuff. So I think that's one way that we try to talk about race, and that those lead to other conversations, but not always. Sometimes it's just we're reading a book about this child and their experience, and we leave it at that. But other times it leads to like a deeper conversation about race and racism. So it kind of provides that context, like you're saying, Dean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the like intentionality behind like what you're sharing and how you're describing the way you and your partner have decided to raise your children, um, who we may get to meet shortly. It sounds like.
Yeah,
Um, uh,
knocking on the door.
um, and I think a lot of the conversation, like nationally right now, is like I think there's a good portion of the population that already knew that racism was systemic, and another portion that is coming to grips with that for the first time. But if we're going to overcome something that is systemic, then it takes intentional work to tear that down, because when you're not being intentional, what our children are seeing on magazine covers and anything they're looking at on online or media, whatever else, like it's a lot of those messages are counterproductive to the principles and values we're hoping our children will adopt. So yeah, I hadn't heard that statistic, but it makes sense that you would have to be intentional to such a strong degree. And I certainly, growing up where I grew up, like I did not have that experience, and I'm like daily having to uproot things that I find in myself, and I would like to spare my daughter that experience. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
as you were talking, I was reminded of a group of students I got to work with in Chicago. A number of like worked with a really diverse college access program. We intentionally like pulled students from all over the city because neighborhoods in Chicago are themselves very segregated. Um, and through that experience, I remember a conversation with like 3 or 4 um, Black high school young men. Just like the program was based on like STEM enrichment, and they were just like complete nerds. And I just loved hearing them talk about comic books and video games that I had never heard of. And I was just like, to your point of both like heroic and also everyday conversations. It's like, this is like, it was edifying to me to be able to observe that kind of conversation and be like, I've been, as a white young man growing up, I was in conversations like that, and how much those, like having that experience now, just increases my ability to empathize and see the humanity in everyone.
Mm. You know, that's interesting. While I sit here in Utah, and again, if anybody's not been to Utah, it is majority white and Mormon. Um, and there are Hispanics and such like that. So it very much is more white and Hispanic based area. And, just as we have this conversation, I think about everywhere my kids and I are going through, and typically we're the only Black family walking through. And I wonder, all the conversations that we're having right now, how can I spark that conversation with somebody, a friend here, where this is going to sound silly, but when I leave, I don't know when they're going to see another Black guy, because unfortunately, where I live, I am the example for most people in my life. I'm the one Black guy that they knew or know. So throughout all this, most of my amazing white friends have reached out to me to figure out, like, how do we have those conversations, because we're scared to have those conversations, because it's Black Lives Matter, and it's Blue Lives Matter, and the world is just so split on, you can't have any middle ground. You got to choose a side, when all of it does matter. We're talking about something specific here, but how do we spark those conversations where people aren't going to be exposed to, people aren't going to enjoy the beauty of diversity? I'm not sure. How do you educate? That's a bigger level than us, but again, I think it goes back to these conversations we talked about as fathers. I'm going to see some fathers this week, and I'm sure a conversation with them, and just because especially where they live, I'm just curious where the mindsets are at, and if there's any way that I can help influence and open a conversation around it. And I never really thought of it until now, being so far from Boston, where I do have diversity. I haven't been home for 14 years, so I didn't realize. Luke, like you're saying, like where the type of life where you come from. I grew up in that exact type of lifestyle, being the only colored man, and those things are important. And I try to show my kids, there are Black leaders out there, and leadership, and that's important to know. So when they see a business owner, that it's not just that anybody else but Black men are doing that, because we are. And I'd watched a conversation recently, and a lady made a comment about knowledge and how we get through this. Obviously, it's based off education, and part of that education is knowing how great that everybody is, right? That each race has greatness in it, and even though our history books tend to tell a very strict narrative, it doesn't tell the whole story of everybody. So understanding that everybody is great and taking the time to learn those, obviously we know is going to be paramount. I'm not sure, how do you maintain those conversations in a area where they're not going to be exposed to the diversity? What are your thoughts?
Gordon, I made a decision that it's not my desire to convince anybody, right? Like I would
Sure.
never try to convince someone um, that as a father, I am relevant in my child's life. I'd rather spend that
Right.
time being relevant in my child's life. I'm
Mm.
not
Absolutely.
spend time talking about the value of walking on 2 feet or all of the different things that I happen to do. So
Hmm.
if it's a conversation, I'm willing to have it. But if just as a, for example, as just a premise, if you don't think fathers are important in a kid's life, it's probably not someone who I'm interested in speaking to. If you don't think
Right.
that Black lives matter, okay, that's you, and I don't feel the need to spend any of my bandwidth trying to
Right.
convince someone who's made up their mind some other way. Now, as it relates to once we're on the same page about just the basic foundation, yeah, fathers are great, and then we can butt all the other aspects. If you think that racism exists and this is something that we want to address so that our kids can be better, then we can brainstorm and have the conversation all day long. But the exhaustion to me comes from trying to have that fundamental foundational concept and not even agreeing on that. And so that's not something I'm willing to engage on because I don't think it's valuable. And that's just my own personal line. It and as a to give you some idea, I'm a single parent. I'm a single co-parent actually. You guys know this. The audience doesn't know this. My internet was acting up, so I'm actually in my daughter's mother's home right now while I film this. So we work well together. Um, so I'm not
Good.
the one to talk to about hating the other spouse or invalidating the other part of the child's relationship. I'm not saying those circumstances don't exist, but I think that the value can be added, and then part of I guess being a mediator is finding that common ground. And once we have
Right.
that initial common ground, we can go a million different directions. But that common ground is important, or else, like again, the conversation's not anchored.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? Because some people set up their lives to not have to think about race. Specifically, white folks that I know set up their lives to not have to think about race or not have to interact with anyone who's different than them. And like, they'll be the
Mm.
the first people to say like I'm not racist, and to which I'll say, okay, but are you anti-racist, right? And because there's a difference, right? And I think I
Mm.
really appreciate how the conversation is shifting around that in the country to saying like it's not enough just to not be racist, but like are people working on being anti-racist? Because to me, that's like a more active kind of or proactive process where people are really working on their stuff, right? And owning their blind spots and saying, yeah, like I've got stuff that it's in the air we breathe, right? And I'm not proud of it, but like it's my responsibility to take some action around that, right? Because I don't want to keep passing this down to my kids. And like those are the people that I want to invest time and energy into, people who are at least at that point. And I'm hopeful that more and more people will get to that point, so they're ready to sort of look at themselves and be honest and you know take make some different choices and take some different actions, and definitely invite anyone and everyone into that conversation because it's I think for the future of our country and for the future of our kids, like we need to be having these difficult conversations. So I just want to say I really hear you, Dead.
If
Dean.
nothing else comes from this moment in time, I think just a paradigm shift from simply not being racist, not being enough. In baseball, we understand tie goes to the runner. As it pertains to this system, your neutrality goes to the racist
Yep.
because this is a system that your standing by and doing nothing will only continue. So if if I mean, I hope that systematic change comes or systemic change comes, but if nothing else but people realizing and recognizing that everybody has a role and you opting out or opting to do nothing is actually playing a role that someone has for you to continue their system, then I think that we can be able to even have some incremental growth.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. And Gordon, like I hear I hear and appreciate the heart behind like your initial question or your musings about like how you can contribute to that. Um, but yeah, I also agree that like I think people that look like me need to take more of the responsibility. And like you're already carrying a lot of that for your community, it sounds like. And like more power to you for what you've done and what you continue to do.
Mm.
But I think there's a lot more that like I personally need to take responsibility for, and people that are like in my life and are more likely to encounter me and listen to me need to hear stories that contradict the little bubble that they've constructed for themselves. And I think yeah, wherever we can present narratives that deconstruct that or counteract that, like that's a responsibility that I need to act on, and other white folks need to act on, and that's how we can work together to tear down that system.
We have a question from Facebook. It's you can take your pick. Either how do you find those in your community who are anti-racist, or how do you help people move from I'm not racist to being anti-racist, particularly as it relates to the children?
Mm.
Particularly, what was the last part, bud?
As it relates to their children. So I can read it again. How do you find those in your community who are anti-racist? Or the second question is, how do you help move people from I'm not racist to being anti-racist, especially as it relates to children?
Mm. So I would say finding somebody that is not racist. Today, you need to be at a protest.
Mm.
I would say would be the best option. Being active in the community and going to the to the candlelight vigils, the rallies, participating in that would probably be your most impactful way to commune with others that are at least have that guard down or open minded. That's probably the best way to find them. Um, Outside of that, it's going to have to come from your conversations, I would say. Um, I can never tell when somebody is racist until they open their mouth and say something or do something. So unfortunately, it's not a blatant thing, and being neutral or being an ally is not a blatant thing either. No one's walking around saying like, "Hey, I love black people," or "I love Mexicans," or "I love Asians." It's our interactions and the way that we treat each other, which again, it's not a blatant sign. Those conversations are going to be crucial.
No, you're absolutely
Go
right.
ahead, bud.
Because there are people who love those groups whose actions still might reflect racism. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, there are people who may be married to someone who is displaying bigoted actions. So that I mean
So,
that's
so,
tough. Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you. So even so like my grandfather was racist, right? So my parents adopted me. My two white parents adopted me. My father's dad did not like that they had chosen to adopt me. Now this is in the 90s. Eventually they did fall away from that, but those are one of those things that passed along to my brother, my oldest brother, who was closest with my grandfather, who would come home and use those slang and use those terms. Um, so it's tough because you can't always know when and where that what is it called, it's like a hidden bias where you're not really aware that you are racist
Mm-hmm.
because of the area you grew up in or your personal beliefs. Until you're exposed to that situation, you got to you have to be exposed to that stimulus or that trigger, which again unfortunately is diversity. um, that's a lot
Right.
of times when we find out that somebody is feels a different type of way when they are challenging their status quo of that lifestyle or that lens, like you said, Luke. That lens of the lifestyle that we've built or that we've been given.
Yeah, I agree. On the second question, how do you help move people from I'm not racist to anti-racist? I think it all goes to the tools that we're giving our kids. And I want to reiterate, it's not a new set of tools. Most of us have talked to our kids about how to act when there's a bully. You know, how is
Mm-hmm.
that any different when there's racism involved? It's just bullying for a different reason, not the smallest kid or not the girl or not pulling the hair. So we've
Mm-hmm.
already given our kids these tools. This is back where we talk about the values. Um, just empower them to, and let them know, what? It may be everybody else who's doing it, but I've raised you to stand up for or to not take part in things that you know are wrong. And maybe to stand up, maybe to walk away, depending on the values, depending on the household. But we're already giving the kids these tools, just kind of expand the scope.
Mm.
Yeah.
And absolutely,
Yeah.
definitely not. Don't be afraid to befriend them as well. Befriending, if you're in an area where there is not diversity, befriending that family that is diverse and getting to know the parents and their how they work and their customs and courtesies of their family. I feel like would educate the whole family as well, because the reality is, if it's just the kid, that's not going to do us as good. If we can educate as parents, as we were talking as fathers and parents, if we can educate the whole family, that will broaden the aspect. And yeah, that's it.
Kids are consumed with the notion of fairness. I mean, they don't want to hurt animals. They don't want to hurt trees. My kids' feelings are hurt when people drop trash. They're already
Mm-hmm.
set to be advocates. All we need
Yeah.
to do is give them the data so that this is just another area where they can show their version of advocacy.
Yeah, and kids really need, the research shows that kids really need explicit messages about racism and how to be anti-racist. And so really, again, this is like the language that my partner uses a lot in Speak Up, her organization. But like, racism is a lie. It's a lie that people with lighter skin or white skin are better than or more valuable than people with dark skin, and that is not true, and like kind of putting it in that framework of like fairness and a lie, like things that they already have some conception of, so that they can say, oh, okay, that's what this is, right? Because I think the less we question it and the less we just sort of go along with it, then the more they feel like, well, it's not that big a deal, right? But we wouldn't be quiet if there was a bully bullying someone who is smaller, right? And so why we shouldn't be quiet. We don't want to be quiet or teach them to be quiet when someone's saying something that's bigoted or biased. So I think those explicit messages and getting comfortable with it, part of the work we do in Speak Up is we have like a whole session that's focused on role playing, and we like we get scenarios that parents have said, this is what my kid said to me this week, how would you respond, and we role play it, right? Because it's like, to me, I think learning the language of race and racism, it's like learning a language, right? And as a white person,
Mhm.
it's not a language I was taught growing up, right? So in order for me to become more fluent in it, like any language, I need to practice it and I need to like get more confident. So those role playing and talking about it with a partner or a friend, um, that's a way to kind of like prepare yourself for this conversation. And starting young, right? It's like starting at 3 or 4 years old. A lot of people think, oh, I'm not going to talk to my kid about that at that age. Like, I don't want to like ruin like their image of like what how great a society we live in or something. And like they already know, right? They're seeing this stuff. So let's like be real with them. Obviously, I'm not sharing like really violent stuff with my 3-year-old, or scary stuff. But at the same time, I'm not gonna like delude him into thinking like that the world is perfect, because that's not gonna be helpful for him either.
We just got the 10-minute warning. So if we can just take a few minutes on these last two questions, and that way we have space in case any other questions come through. One of the questions that was provided to us is, what are we willing to learn to make our children thrive? What do you guys think? I'll just put a quick answer out there. I think if we are willing to be uncomfortable, I think that creates a space. And if we're willing to show our children that we are uncomfortable and that we don't know, I think that has value.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's a
huge.
crucial word. That's something like as a white man, as somebody who like has more of the option to opt out of these conversations if I wanted to. I think that's especially key for like a keyword for me to hear and apply. Like if I am comfortable, then I'm probably in the I'm not racist camp, not the anti-racist camp. And like that's going to look different for every person, right? Like that like it may make you really uncomfortable to go to a protest, to do any number of like actions in your community. It may make you really uncomfortable to call out your family member who you've never challenged on one of their beliefs that like what they're saying just isn't true. But yeah, I think the willingness to like get out of my comfort zone is really crucial. So thank you for that word you did.
And if nothing else on that one, this is an important question because it'll apply to all of us at some point. How do we say sorry when we make a mistake or step in it?
Yeah, actually I was going to add a little bit to what you both had said, and so I think that's a good bridge. But I think like I'm really trying to model both in my relationship and my my with my partner, but also with my kids, like saying I'm sorry when I'm wrong, and having like practicing humility and not pretending that like I know everything or that I've got it right. So I think that's something that I want them to be able to. That's a skill or like a approach I want them to be able to have as well, because I think I just think it's really valuable to be able to listen to people. And I had an experience with a good friend of color. Um, where I did step in it just a few weeks ago, right after George Floyd and the the sort of the uprising here in Chicago, and I knew from talking to him and just texting with him that he was struggling, and rather than like reach out to him and just listen and hear what he was going through, I sent him like a text with like a video, thinking like I kind of knew what he needed, and I didn't hear from him. It was like radio silence. And then like 3 days later, he like texted me and he's like, "I love you, but like you really messed up, and that really hurt when you didn't, when you sent that video." And I felt sick to my stomach, and I felt terrible, and but I knew like that was really important for me to hear, and I just, I wrote back a text and I apologized and I just said, you're right. I really did screw up, and I appreciate the feedback, and, we're back on better terms now. Fortunately, he was able to kind of forgive me. And I really appreciate that. But like, I think if I had reacted, you know, and gotten really defensive or been like, what are you talking about, and ignored or denied what he was saying, like I could have lost that friendship. So like again, practicing that like that humility and saying I'm sorry and acknowledging when I screw up is for me a really important thing I want to practice for myself, but also for my kids, because it's messy work. it's really messy.
I think it takes couth to be able to say that you're sorry, in a situation where you might not know, like we said earlier, you have that bias, you didn't mean to step in it. So it's kind of, knowing when to take that step back and say, accept that there's something going on, because at the end of the day, we can't tell somebody that they're not being racist. I say that right? If I get offended, no one can say that I'm not offended. And that's in any case, not just racism, but specifically with racism. You can't say that, if I say that I'm offended by that, you can't tell me that you're not. And so how does that conversation go from there? How do you say sorry after that? When I'm like, hey, you're being racist. And you're like, I didn't mean it like that. Like, that's how do we navigate that conversation?
Hmm.
That is, it is just the simple bowing down and understanding and asking questions to further understand, where do you come from? Where do I come from? Um, and why do I feel so strongly about this? And, I think the most important part of an apology is, once you understand each other, where do you go from there? You can break away, or you can get closer from this. It might expand your mind, to where you're more involved in that process, or in that person's lifestyle or culture or customs. Um, and it might equal you breaking that conversation and breaking friendship. I think that's a reality that we have to understand in anything that we do, is that once you put it out there, you decide where you're going to go with that conversation and that friendship. And hopefully it turns out that you guys can be on the same page and expand your minds. Um, I do know I've had friends later on, either weeks, months later, come around and, realize that conversation was different, and maybe something happened in their life that expanded their mind, and now they see it differently. But
Mm.
those apologies are heartfelt and, hopefully not shallow. Um, so
Mm.
This work is a marathon, not a sprint. It will take time. There will be hang ups, sound like a Dr. Seuss book, but there'll be pitfalls along the way. And I think when we can be open and honest about when we've made a mistake, that helps us get back on the road to making some progress.
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think
Mhm.
that that's how the healing is going to happen, is that we, if a mistake's going to be made, we got to love each other through it. And be humble in the moment, so we can put down our shields and our guards and look at each other as human beings, and as peers and brothers and sisters, and being able to set that aside and say, yeah, it's about color, but you're hurt right now. What can we do about that?
Mhm.
Mm.
Brian,
Can't
you're
hear
on
you,
Brian, your
mute.
Brian.
speaker, bud.
I knew that. I knew I was going to do that. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Now I've really made my grand entrance. So yeah, I really appreciate the four of you to stepping in, as you were saying, Brett, to this messiness. I think we've had some comments from members of Fathering Together saying, like, why are we doing this work? Like, why bring up these tense moments? They're hot topics. And a lot of the reasons these topics are so hot, are so kind of messy, is because we haven't ever really talked about them. We haven't, as a society, addressed kind of the systemic ways in which racism plays a part in our world. And not just racism, there's so many other isms, right, that we kind of just allow to exist. And so I just want to appreciate the four of you for modeling a conversation and helping our viewers kind of see how we can navigate some of these tough conversations, and humble ourselves enough to say, either I'm sorry, I haven't acknowledged your pain, or how do I step into this and just begin a conversation from the youngest of ages to where we are now as fathers and adults. So again, appreciate you all, Britt, Corden, Didon, and Luke. Really appreciate what you're bringing to this space, but also to the communities you're a part of, and look forward to many more conversations one-on-one with you, but also just to see kind of the work that you're doing in your community. So I'm sure my kids will be yelling at me shortly too. So if you do have more questions as you're watching, if questions have come up for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or any one of our panelists. If you're looking for resources, again, put those questions in the comment. We'll get to those resources. We're building more resources on our website, fatheringtogether.org. So please navigate your way over there if you have follow-up questions after this, or if you're viewing this after the fact when we've got it recorded. So until then, appreciate you all again for being on the panel. Appreciate you all for listening and being a part of today. We will see you around our group, and have a wonderful day as you navigate these conversations. Peace, everyone.
Good being with
Take
you
care,
all.
y'all. Thanks.
Peace.